Right, we now come to the urgent questions. Shadow Secretary of State James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Defence if he will make a statement on his commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the Shadow Defence Secretary on securing this first defence urgent question of the new Parliament. It is the case, in fact, that previous Defence Secretaries answered just 2 urgent questions in the whole of the last 5 years. And, Mr. Speaker, while I can't promise to answer every one of the future UQs, I wanted to come today with this first to underline just how seriously I take our department's responsibility to report to this House. Mr. Speaker, this government has a cast-iron commitment to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence. We promised this in our manifesto at the election. The Prime Minister promised it at NATO in Washington in July. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, promised this in the budget 2 weeks ago, as well as announcing a £3 billion boost for defence spending next year to start to fix the foundations for our armed forces. And this, of course, is on top of £3 billion each year for Ukraine. And I remind the House that, of course, the last time this country did spend 2.5% of GDP on defence was in 2010 with the last Labour government, a level not matched in any of the 14 Tory years since. Mr. Speaker, everyone agrees that defence spending must increase to match and deal with the threats that we face. And one of our very first acts as a government was to launch the Strategic Defence Review, which is working at pace to look at the threats we face, the capabilities we need and the resources we have available. Because, Mr. Speaker, this isn't just about how much we spend, but it is how we spend it too. And the Prime Minister said at NATO that our plan in the SDR will come first, then we will set out the pathway to spending 2.5%. And the Chief Secretary to the Treasury said yesterday this will come in the spring. Mr. Speaker, today is Armistice Day. Earlier at the 11th hour, I had the honour of laying a wreath at the cenotaph. And today is a reminder of what's at stake in this new era of insecurity, a reminder that our dedicated servicemen and women around the clock, around the world, work to keep us safe, and a reminder of the ultimate sacrifice that so many have made in the past so that we may live in freedom today. We will remember them.
James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for granting this urgent question, especially on Armistice Day. I'll just say to the Secretary of State, I'm very grateful for his response, but he keeps going back to 2010, and when we spent 2.5% is true, but without adding the fact that they had bankrupted the country. And in fact, I asked the House of Commons Library about this. The IFS confirmed that had they returned to government, they were planning cuts to the defence budget of 20 to 25%, Mr. Speaker. But this question is about today, when the threat picture is now far graver than for many generations, as confirmed by CDS at the weekend. Now, as the Secretary of State said, the Labour Party committed in its General Election Manifesto to a path to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, and the Prime Minister said shortly after taking office it was cast iron, as the Secretary of State repeated today. And with President Trump's election victory, there will inevitably be a greater focus on what more European NATO members can do to boost Europe's own defence. But yesterday, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and this morning the Secretary of State himself were unable to say whether the government would deliver on 2.5% in the current Parliament. In addition, yesterday the Sunday Times reported that DNS and Abbey Wood have effectively been instructed to avoid any new procurement at all for the rest of this financial year. Mr. Speaker, 2.5% is not an end in itself. The key reason in April we set out a fully funded multi-year pathway to 2.5% was to enable the MOD to procure at pace and at scale the munitions we need to urgently replenish our stocks to war-fighting levels. With the whole world wanting to buy more munitions, we cannot afford to delay any further. But I have key questions for the Secretary of State, because at the same time we're having this debate, sir, there are a whole load of new burdens coming for the MOD which they will have to cover. So can the Secretary of State answer the following? In which financial year does he expect the share of GDP spent on defence to start rising significantly? And will he guarantee to hit 2.5% this Parliament, yes or no? Now, not including existing programmes, is it true that there is a freeze on new procurement at DNS for the rest of this financial year? Will the MOD be 100% compensated by the Treasury for higher employer national insurance contributions and for the cost of increasing CEA? And will service families be 100% compensated for the extra VAT on school fees? Penultimately, sir, on Armistice Day, can the Secretary of State absolutely rule out surviving spouses of service personnel being taxed on death-in-service benefits? And finally, on the Chagos Islands, in the department's written answer to me, they refuse to say how much the MOD will contribute to renting back our own military base. So it's a very simple question. He won't tell us how much it's going to cost. Can he tell us, does he know how much it's going to cost?
Well done. That's a good say. In granting the urgent question, we are limited to how much time each person has. We can remember that. 2 minutes for the main opposition, 1 minute for the other opposition. Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, 14 years his Conservative government had to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. And it wasn't a plan or a pathway from the last government, as the Shadow Defence Secretary tries to claim. It was a political ploy. It was announced 4 weeks before they then called the general election. It was unfunded. It was a con on the armed forces and on the British people, who gave their answer emphatically by sweeping away Tory MPs in many of the proudest military communities and constituencies across the country. Mr Speaker, on his accusations about a total spending freeze, we are putting in place, and I am putting in place, a grip on out-of-control spending that the last government left. We're securing value for money, we're cutting waste, and we're getting a grip of defence spending in a way that his government did not. On the continuous education allowance, we greatly value this allowance. We greatly recognise the role it plays in helping avoid the disruption of children's education of serving personnel. And in line with how the allowance operates already, we will continue to pay up to 90% of private school fees following the VAT increase in January. So by uprating the cap, we take account of any increase in spending. And on the Chagos Islands, of course I know the details because I was heavily involved in the negotiations. This secures Britain's military base. It secures a military base for our US allies, which is why they welcomed it so strongly. And I've said to the Shadow Secretary, and I've said to this House, when it debates the treaty, will have that full information. And nobody, Mr Speaker, knows better the defence inheritance that 14 years of the Conservative government have left in the last 4 months than the Shadow Defence Secretary. He was the Defence Minister at the heart of the problems, with billion-pound black holes, service morale at record lows, a crisis in recruitment and retention of personnel. Never again must a government leave our armed forces in a worse state than when they found them. And this is a government that will make this country more secure at home and strong abroad.